This is Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Here are your hosts, Dr. Tim Slecker and Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, educated educators talking education.
Yeah, that's what we love to do here. It's Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Educated educators talking education. 1 full hour, Busted Pencils across all civic media. Everybody out there, you're listening. We appreciate you. Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, producer Jess, my two friends. Johnny, how you doing?
Man, doing great. You know, it's break from teaching over these holidays. And so, hey, listeners, teachers out there, hope you're getting lots of rest and reset in because, you know, pretty soon we're coming up on that get back to the classroom vibe. So, you know, I'm soaking up all that rest in and lots of ideas spinning around in my head for teaching next semester. So, you know, it's always exciting to be here with the listeners on Saturday. And Tim, our guest today, we've been reading, and this is right up both of our alleys. Tim, he'll introduce our guest in a minute, but he sent me a book a couple of weeks ago. He said, Johnny, you got to read this. This is the stuff we're always teaching and talking about. And Tim, you couldn't be more right. So I'm excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jess, what about you? What's going on in your world?
Well, you know, we're in that sort of weird period where it's the last week of the year. There's a lot of reflection going on, a lot of looking back at this year of 2024 and going, man, some things went really, really well. And some things, well, you know, maybe in the next year we can do things a little bit differently. So I've been stewing in this reflective period. And something that I know that has been just absolute top marks is busting pencils with you two fine doctors.
Wow. My goodness. Thank you, Jess. That felt so good to hear that. Yeah, Johnny, though, talking about our guest, I came across, Jess and Johnny know, and the listeners know, Tim stalks social media for guests. And when I find them, then I hound them until they either block me or I eventually get them to agree to come on the show. And I just saw our guest out there posting some interesting replies to some people, and then got him on LinkedIn, and then saw the book, and then, man, we had this conversation. Let's get him in here, though. He is an educational provocateur, learning environment specialist, an advocate for equity and progressive education. His nonlinear journey spans from struggling as a dyslexic student to becoming a studio art major, NYPD detective, and eventually an expert in K-12 education transformation. He is the author of the new book, Designed to Fail. Welcome to Busted Pencils, Ira David Socol. Hi, Ira. How you doing?
I'm good, Tim. And Johnny, thank you for having me. I know that my personal journey is interesting, but I think that gives me a lot of commonality with a whole lot of the students who are on the schools today, whether their lives have been really interesting up to this point or will be in the future.
Well, I think about that. You know, one of the things Johnny and I always try to bring to the show is this idea of connection to the students. You know, we refer to ourselves as the blue collar scholars. Johnny growing up in Detroit, me growing up in Pittsburgh, you know, doing that kind of, you know, really recognizing that guess what? There's a whole lot of kids out there that typically sometimes might find school challenging, and there's a whole lot of reasons why. And in fact, though, Ira, this is what we're going to be digging deep into, your new book, Designed to Fail, A History of Education in the United States. But, you know, you said, yeah, you have an interesting pathway to this position. And, you know, we talked before to get ready for the show, and I was wondering, though, if you can talk a little bit about your experience as a learner, and that kind of moment when we were, you know, you were talking about this, that it was when, and I'll let you tell the story, when something happened and you ended up in a different educational environment where things started to click. if you can kind of just walk us through your experience as a learner.
Well, I think I'm a good learner, and I think I'm really bad in traditional formal education. I think I learn things pretty quickly. I think I have a really strong memory. I think I have really good visual skills. What I can't do is sit still in a room and listen to somebody drone on. And the other thing I can't do is turn my interests on and off based on a bell schedule. But I began school with two basic things that just aren't acceptable in schools: the inability to read, to decode alphabetical text, and a real inability to sort of sit still and be completely compliant. It's just not in me. And that creates an amazing challenge to any sort of traditional teacher in any traditional school. And because of my age, I was also growing up in a time when people had very few strategies for kids with dyslexia. The term ADHD didn't even exist yet. It's actually referred to as minimal brain damage. And I did have, and I try to express this to people, there were educators who tried to do things, but there was nothing that was going to smooth out the system that just didn't work for me. And when things went really bad in middle school, and they went really, really bad, and I was told that I was going to an alternative high school, which, usually carries a certain connotation, but I had this moment of luck in my life, which hadn't always happened up to that point. The alternative high school had just been taken over by a couple of teachers who, working with Neil Postman, had redesigned a lockdown school into a school without walls, which is a remarkable transformation. And what that school did was it shifted all the responsibility for learning onto us as students. To quote one of the teachers, it was to eliminate all the excuses we had. You hate this teacher. You think it's the wrong time of the day. You don't want to sit in this classroom. Whatever it is that's blocking you, you figure it out. We're just telling you have to get these New York State credits and to graduate, and you tell us how to do it. And if something doesn't work, stop doing it and do something else. And so what that enabled me to do was to actually find a path to do things. And it's not like I ever read a book in high school. I didn't. I couldn't have if I wanted to, but it was the kind of place where you could be around people who were there for all sorts of different reasons, but some of them were great readers. And I listened to people talk about books, and I listened to people talk about music and talk about math and things. And in the way that humans learn, I started to figure things out, because, that I learned a term from Irish educators, about aspirational peers. We learn best from other kids. And that's what worked for me in a big way. And that, although I had never really considered the idea of going to college before, it's what allowed me to think about that and do that, get out of my hometown and move forward.
Well, you think about, so that the description there too is without this alternative high school, as you said, Ira, too, and anybody listening, Busted Pencils too, they know what we're talking about. In fact, if you want to let us know, it's 608-557-8577. That's the Busted Pencils mailbag. You can leave us a voicemail. Hey, ask us a cool question, a comment. We may even play it on the air. And everybody listening right now on Saturday out there, you're listening across all the civic media stations. 855-752-4842. The number, you can text us anything, all those questions, and we want to hear from you. We appreciate it. We have our guest, the author of Designed to Fail, Ira Socol, kind of remembering what it was in that experience as a learner in schools, and finally getting into an alternative high school, and the reality, a school without walls, putting the responsibility of saying, here's what it takes to get out of here. You figure out how to do it. Ira, think about that though. How many students, though, in a way, right? You were being shipped off because, quote, there was no other place for you in these pathways. How many students does this happen to? Yeah, Johnny pushed out, right? I hear this. School, it isn't set up, and I see, man, we're going long on our first segment, so before I put out a kind of a twisted question that leaves somebody out there to go, it just reminds me though too, and I remember when I was the dean of the School of Education at Edgewood College there in Madison, Wisconsin. One of my most powerful moments was when the Madison Metropolitan School District principal for, quote, the alternative high school invited me to bring future student teachers for the possibility that they might do their student teaching in that school. And it was, again, that experience. It was that alternative. You had students there. Their role, their responsibilities were to, here are the credits, here are the requirements. And the teachers and the principal there just really allowed that type of freedom that those students thrived in. And I remember having those conversations, particularly with the students and then my future teachers, who absolutely decided that, why doesn't school look like this all the time? I think that's the issue that we're going to be talking about. The book is Designed to Fail. The question, though, Ira, were schools really designed to fail? Really? It's the history of American education. It's Busted Pencils, fully leaded. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. This is Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Dr. Johnny Lupinacci here with Dr. Tim Slecker, producer, chairman of the boards. Jess on the boards holding it down tonight. And our guest, Ira Socol, here talking about, his book, which provides, I'll jump right into it, a really good discussion, a thorough critique. But when I say critique, he's not just poking holes. It's kind of answering questions and posing questions about, if we know things aren't going that well in schools, why do we keep doing them? Right. And so there's a long history of this in American schooling. And so getting into it, we started to jump into it last section, but I wanted to come back around to it and ask you, Ira, to kind of just break it down. This you set up such a wonderful critique of what you were sharing, you called traditional education, and on the show, I'll often talk about schooling versus education, and that we know schooling. And for most kids, right, you have to really kind of adhere to a system of compliance, all the things you write about in your book. You have to fall in line, or it doesn't work for you. You're pushed out. And you shared one of those stories for you. You were pushed out to a place where some educators were working really radically different than schooling. And they found ways to engage you and to have you, formally in a setting, although it was called alternative, be a learner and partake in education. So I just wonder if we get into that a little bit for our listener. We're talking about, the history of American schooling so dominantly. What Ira shared is traditional education. but can you give the listener a little bit about like just the nuts and bolts? So what do we mean by this? Doing things the way we've always done it.
Well, Johnny, I think the first thing that we've always done is that school has always been built primarily around compliance,
Mm,
and that's very, very intentional because public schooling in this country began when uh, this country faced its first flood of immigrants who were different, who didn't speak English, who were not Protestant, um, who didn't have that work ethic that people, that has been part of our myths for a very long time. And the purpose then was to sort of integrate them into a society. It even goes back way before we really had public schools. And the revolution had people talking about, developing citizens who were part of a machine. So it's always been a compliance driven thing. It's never been about learning, and it has always flown in the face of the way children actually learn. Children learn by imitating, they learn by their own curiosity, they learn on their own timetables, and they learn with the way their individual brains work. And that's never been a priority. So schools are based on an economic, uh, an economic and political agenda, which says that we need compliant citizens, and we need people who will be okay working for low pay, doing meaningless jobs. And if you think about what kids actually learn in a traditional classroom, that is what they learn. I say a lot that kids really don't pay any attention to anything we say as adults.
Mm.
What they pay attention to is what we do and how we behave. And so what we teach kids is that it's perfectly okay for us to interrupt them anytime we feel like, whether it's by changing subject areas or making announcements over a PA system. They tell us that totally boring work is somehow preparation for life. We should, do 50 of these same math problems. We tell them that their curiosity doesn't matter because we're going to ignore them because that curiosity interrupts our lesson plans. And what that leaves us with is kids who either get um, trained out of their own interests, or who get kicked out of the education system.
mm.
That's your choice. And the fact that that's continued pretty solidly since the 1840s, despite all sorts of people attempting to change it, speaks, volumes. And I think most closely expressed by, I have a quote in the book from a Texas school superintendent who's most famous for suspending a kid for having black hair, who said, to be an American is you have to be compliant. I mean, that's the belief system that drives it all.
Boy, with that though, too, Ira, I mean, the indictment there too is really powerful because when we start to then say like, why are things the way they are, and why do we keep repeating things that quote don't work? I wonder though too, what we do here on Busted Pencils when we're talking about fully leaded education talk, and we have great guests like Ira Socol and talking about his book Designed to Fail, that we know it doesn't work, but we, Ira, they don't care about me, you, Johnny, Jess. We aren't part of the system. And in fact, as you said, all the attempts, whether it's Dewey or anybody who's tried to change this system, we're not part of the we, and the system is working just fine. It's working just perfectly, and any attempt to take down that system gets met with an incredible, powerful status quo resistance that absolutely has time and time and time and time again said, no, schooling is about making you compliant and go in and take your part in this economic system that is driven to actually your job is to go out and get a job, but to keep wealth and power in place as it is.
Well, and just, very quickly, if you go to schools for rich kids, say St. Anne's in Brooklyn or think places like that, you will see a completely different education system.
Hmm.
The people being educated to be the leaders are getting a completely different kind of education. They are getting that freedom to think and freedom to move, because the people with power and wealth know that's what works and that's what they want for their kids. They want something different for the rest of us.
Hmm. It's Busted Pencils. It's fully leaded education talk. Our guest, Ira Socol, his book, new book, brand new. Get it out there. Or order it. Designed to Fail: A History of Education in the United States. We're talking about this. In fact, Ira, I want to put this question before we go to the break. We want to get into this history because I have to admit, you made me acquainted with a new character, Elwood Patterson Cubberley, as somebody that if we're studying the history of American education and why it is the way it is, boy, what a person this person is. More when we get back. Busted Pencils, fully leaded. Welcome back, Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Educated educators talking education. Tim, we'll always ask you how. That's Tim McElrath, Rise Against. We love that. Just always bringing us the best bumper music.
Every time you address Tim McIlrath, I have a moment where I'm like, Tim is talking in the third person again. He is giving himself a little pep talk. That's great, but let's do it off air, man.
Yeah, no. Tim, the lead singer of Rise Against. We love that. Hey, in fact, if you love that music and want to tell us about it, tell producer Jess. The number is 608-557-8577. 608-557-8577. Let us know. Ask questions. We want to hear from you. And if you're out there right now listening across all of the civic media network applications to listen to the show, 855-752-4842. 855-752-4842. That's the text line. Send us a text. Let us know. Let us know what you're thinking. Our guest, Ira Socol, we're talking about his brand new book, just released, Designed to Fail: A History of Education in the United States. I left you, though, with, and we're not going to spend a lot of time, but this person that you introduced me to, Elwood Patterson Cubberley, just a little bit on his impact on designing the system that, in one way, we still have.
Well, Coverley's most important role is creating the myth that this
Right.
was an inevitable system and the natural way that we would work. He And what drove his power was the length of time. He was the dean of education at Stanford for decades, and he wrote pretty much all the textbooks that teachers were trained with from 1920 to almost 1960. He wrote every textbook that every teacher had when they went through the education system. Um, The problem for all of us is that he was an incredible racist. He was a eugenicist. Uh, he believed in natural superiority of certain people and natural inferiority of everybody else. He, when we got toward World War II, he turned out to be quite the fascist on top of it. He was a very big Mussolini fan. So you have somebody doing this. And what he did was he sort of rewrote the history so that he eliminated all the people who were challenging these ideas. So you never hear about people like William Alcott, who in the 1830s and 1840s was really pushing for child-centered education. And people like Ella Flagg Young, who, sort of ran the school that John Dewey studied, and ended up being the first female superintendent of those schools in Chicago, and all the other people who tried to do very different things. He wiped them out of history, so there was only one narrative going. And one of the things that's happened in the years since then is, though in the 50s there was a rising tide of criticism against him, except for John Taylor Gatto, everybody else writing the history of education has forgotten him, completely left him out. And when you leave somebody like that out, you leave out the cause of what we're doing. And I pick on all the professors from Stanford because they're in a building that Coverly paid for. When they go downstairs to have lunch, they eat in the Coverly Cafe. He was this dominant guy, but they never write about him. They never talk about him. And it's that myth that this is the norm that's so dangerous, because Americans, as they do in most other things, don't compare themselves to other countries. They don't look at what other people are doing in different ways. I always laugh when people say, well, kids can't learn to read by sight word recognition. And I say, gee, I wonder how everybody in China figures it out, you know? But, we don't think about any of those things. So we don't look at any alternative ideas because we believe this is the natural, logical evolution that's brought us here. And that's clamped down on the other narratives that talk about how we build a different kind of citizenry and a different kind of economy by developing different kind of learners who can trust their own abilities and curiosities.
Well, you talk about that though too in the book. I mean, there are you kind of hinted, but there has been a push against. You say, if a counter to this very sterile kind of compliant, stay in your place type of education. How as we're looking here now, thinking about that, I mean, are we due for another one? And when? And because, well, I know Johnny and Tim and Jess, we're ready for another one. In fact, we're trying to get it going. Johnny, right? I mean, busted pencils. Let's get this pushing. Johnny, I could see you're like, dude, what are you talking about?
Yeah, man, I'm getting lost in the sauce, man, because I'm vibing with this. I love this when we're looking at why we do things the way we do, right? And one of the important roles that history plays, and Ira sharing with us here, that why it's important to have the histories, have the diverse, stories that are about what happened. Also to have historians, right? It's not just like, hey, I heard this happened, or oh, there's this perspective. It's actually, like a discipline, like a craft. There are people who are historians that provide us with this understanding of those patterns so that we can hopefully, I think that's where Ira's going too with this, is interrupt those dominant patterns and say, hey, just because right now, the best reason we have, other than the goals of keeping people sorted and maintaining social class and power, like you've talked about, Tim, as sort of primary purpose of schooling, The only other goal here that comes up is why do we do things the way we do? Well, because that's how we've always done them. Right. And so when we say, well, let's do them differently, how do we not reproduce the patterns of the past? Right. And this is the important thing of like Ira's book and having historians and having diverse perspectives on what's worked and what hasn't worked so that we don't. So we truly interrupt. And that task is much harder to do than to talk about. To interrupt the patterns of the past is actually a lot harder. So I really like this conversation because it's like, it's a rich, clear history of how we keep doing some really, I'll just say them, some really bad ways of having our young people learn to be democratic citizens. Right.
Yeah, no, very Ira, jump in there.
Well, I think what's critical is that things can change. Somebody developed the system we had, and they started in the 1840s and they finished 80 years later. But they were reacting to their times and their specific things. I mean, if you think about the 1840s, you have all of this technological change, this communication capability change. The world is radically different in 1850 than it was in 1840. And you have the second industrial revolution starting, and they may, even if you say these things worked at the time, well, okay. I mean, there's the famous Woodrow Wilson quote that I use, that we do this because we want to fail 80% of kids. We want to get them out of school before high school because we need a lot more minors than we need clerks. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. And so since World War II, we've had this idea that we want to educate everybody, but we're still operating in a system designed not to do that. And when, before the pandemic, Pam Moran and I worked for Pam. She was a superintendent of the school system in Virginia that I worked in for a decade. And now she's sort of a business partner in a educational advising firm. We started asking about 2019, why would kids come to your school if they didn't have to? Now, education is at this existential threat moment. Kids are saying, we're not coming. I mean, not just in the US, in the UK, and parents are saying, you don't have to go because they don't. What the pandemic showed by bringing instruction into the home, suddenly parents were becoming aware of how worthless this all was. What was going on, and how much of it was a waste of time and how disinterested their kids were. So, we've talked to people where schools have 30%, chronic truancy rates. Well, that's not sustainable as things go. So kids are voting with their feet, and even the head of the Carnegie Foundation has said that kids are voting with their feet, that they don't want to do this anymore. But when you go back, all the way back to William Alcott, who said classrooms should be filled with distractions that would get kids interested, that the garden outside was more important than the classroom, that nobody should really be asked to stay in their seat for more than 5 minutes straight. There's a woman named Louisa Parsons Hopkins who in the 1870s in Boston is trying to do a whole sort of maker education thing. Like I said, Ella Flagg Young, who said the division of subjects was like the stupidest thing she'd ever heard of. Why would you do this? People fought wildly against educators, teachers, superintendents, principals fought against the whole idea that you divide kids up by age. There were all these things that were being presented, but we stuck with something because if people don't have real educational opportunities, then the people who have the money keep having the money. And so there are so many ways we could step in and break that. And some of the things that the system that Pam and I worked with, we had 26 schools and about 14,000 students, and every conceivable socioeconomic group and urban, suburban, rural, all sorts of things. We tried to eliminate grades in elementary school. So you had K-5 classrooms with
Mm.
multiple teachers and lots of kids. We tried to eliminate bell schedules in secondary schools and let things go. We tried to really change discipline rules so kids were not getting in trouble all the time.
Mm.
Um, and we tried to change the technology so kids were learning the things they need to learn, use in their life. And it's doable. It worked. We ended up with a 97% on time um, graduation rate and ranked third in Virginia, even though we were nowhere near the top of funding. So it's doable if we have the sort of guts to challenge the system, take things on, and take the risks to try to give kids what they really need.
Oh man, so much there, so much going on. Ira Sokol, the book Designed to Fail, having a great conversation, giving us hope there though too, Ira, because we can design something different. Ira, if I want to get the book or I want to find some more connections, you're talking about your firm with the Sokol Moran or Moran Sokol. Let us know, where do we go?
So the book is available on Amazon, and soon it will be available for any bookstore to order. And as soon as I get around to listening to it all and approve it, we'll have the audio book out. Socolmoran.com will bring you to our website. We're excited to work with anybody who's excited to do things differently.
Thank you so much for busting pencils, Ira.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Johnny and Tim breaking it down when we get back.
This might be our only chance. Let's take this one day at a time. I'll hold your hand if you hold mine. The time that we kill keeps us alive.
Busted pencils, fully leaded education talk. Educated educators talking education. What a great interview, Ira Sokol. What a great book, Designed to Fail. Johnny, I mean, I know what Ira was talking about had to just resonate with you.
Well, absolutely. Like I was saying before, I mean, it's so important to understand the history, right? And to understand why things are the way they are. And I really appreciate Ira's point too. It's so important. And it's why texts like the book he's written and is sharing and these conversations are so helpful in this moment, is because you get stuck and you say, why do we keep doing things the way we do them if we
Mm-hmm.
know they don't work? Well, here's the thing that's really important about what Ira is sharing and like these stories that he's telling in there as a historian is people have known better and done better
Mm-hmm.
before. We don't need to, for lack of better words, we don't need to invent anything. There's no new tech. There's no new like novel idea or discovery. We're at a moment where we know so much about what good learning looks like and can be that we need to do it. Well, that's the really difficult part, is that we're talking about how set in particular ways schools are, right? And Ira talks about them being very factory oriented and very sorting, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of being shaped around compliance. I mean, I'll level up that a little bit and say that they're carceral, right?
Mm.
In this particular moment, they are so much about compliance that they are carceral. They are mimetic of our prison system, which is also a huge problem in this country. Our response to what I'll call cultural resistance, or like Ira talked about getting kicked out of a school, I'll talk about it being pushed out, but a response to the kinds of behaviors that say we know better and we know we should be getting a better education, right? So the resistance is a different kind of behavior. It's bad behavior and you get kicked out. It plays into this system of, a carcerality. You have to
Yeah.
ramp up security. You have to ramp up compliance. In fact, Tim, we talk policy all the time here on Busted
Right.
Pencils. Well, you remember all the zero tolerance laws
Yeah.
that came both in both Democrat and
Oh,
Republican
yeah.
administrations, right? The response to young people saying this isn't working for us and their behavior, all behavior is a form of communication. We can talk to Teacher Hallie and Teacher Joanna,
Yeah. I was just thinking that.
right? But all of that cultural resistance, aka also known in traditional schools as bad behavior, all that cultural resistance, right, is a loud cry saying enough is enough. We need to do things differently. And I love when we can talk to folks who say, and guess what? We don't need to invent it.
Yeah.
Be inspired and rhyme with, right? Isn't it Mark Twain who said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes? So rhyme with some of these examples of people who didn't do school the same way. And
Right.
in other words, they emancipated learning from schooling. That's education, right? The emancipation of learning from schooling, from those factory and carceral models of schools. So I love Ira's work. I love that we're going to keep having conversations with them. I love that we get to do this on Busted Pencils because, hey, interrupting the status quo, Tim, that's our jam, huh?
It's our jam. And, you think about that, the interrupting part, and you made this very clear, and we'll, reinforce it. Why do we have this compliant based system that, isn't working for most kids, and the kids that it does work for, it kind of browbeats the curiosity out of them, the engagement out of them. We have statistics that for every year you spend in school, you get less and less engaged, so that by the time you're graduating, your engagement level is gone. You say, well, how is this happening? And guess what? This is because you have the powerful, not the Democrats, not the Republicans, the powerful across both of those parties that benefit from that system and do everything they can to keep that system in place, to the point that it starts to feel like we don't know anything else. We don't know. And it feels like, I think sometimes, Johnny, we think we have to invent because we don't know the stories of the past and the innovators of the past. Because, and even Ira's story there too, there's been an intentional writing them out. We don't want to even know they existed. We don't want to even introduce these concepts to, let's just say, what you and I do. Future teachers. So much going on there, though. Johnny Lupinacci, I'll throw it over to you because you know what time it is.
It's now time for your moment of Zen. The rule of law does not do away with the unequal distribution of wealth and power, but reinforces that inequality with the authority of the law. It allocates wealth and poverty in such complicated and indirect ways as to leave the victims bewildered.
Thanks, everybody, for busting pencils with us. Again, thank you, Ira Socol. Great book. Love it. Designed to fail. Make sure you have the opportunity to go out, get that book. It's time. Yeah, after Christmas, guess what? People still want gifts. And if you didn't get a good one, hey, you know what? Maybe the other thing is go out and buy yourself a gift, because you know what? Those socks that you got from your grandma, we know those are horrible. You know what? Save them for next year, give them away, re-gift them. Go get that book, man, because it is going to absolutely change everything, because that is something that we want to do, that we always do. Johnny, I see you
Tim, I hope
you're
not,
leaning in.
I'm not going to tell our listeners to go get a book if they didn't get a good gift. Go get a beer, right? Go do something fun. All right, reading books is great, Tim, but there's time to also take a break and just be around folks, and we don't have to change the world one nerd at a time. We can have some fun together too. And so I hope folks are out there doing that. Hey, we love our listeners. We love you being here with us on Saturdays. Remember, tune in for Homeroom on Monday, and we'll see you in 2025 for Class in Session and a whole new year. Busting pencils. Keep busting pencils.